or high. But that's exactly how a computer underneath the hood, so to speak, would store a word like high. Now, what is indeed using these patterns of bits? And what is a computer actually doing at the end of the day? Well, for that, we need to take a look under the hood, so to speak. This is what Intel Inside means. If your Mac or your PC comes with Intel inside, as goes the marketing slogan, that means that your computer has inside of it a CPU, a central processing unit, that looks a little something like this. It's a pretty small device. It's not quite as big as this. This, of course, is not to scale, wouldn't fit in your actual laptop or desktop. But what you see is two sides. This is just a metal case and a nice big logo there. And then if you flip this around, you see the other side, which generally has a whole bunch of golden pins that actually interconnect to a device inside of the computer. And now, what is that device? Well, that device, we'll soon see, is something called the motherboard. A motherboard is a circuit board, so a big piece of silicon or plastic-like material that has a lot of lines running back and forth on it, and often has sockets, essentially a bunch of tiny little holes into which devices like this fit, so that you can put this inside of a computer and actually have it clamp down on something. Now, what does it mean to be a CPU? Well, the CPU is the brains of your computer. It's the thing in your computer that does all of the work, all of the thinking. Now, what kind of thinking does a computer need to do? Well, if you're feeding it all of these numbers and you're feeding it all of these letters, you want to maybe perform math on those numbers. You might want to display those letters on the screen. You might want to add or delete those letters if the user is using a word processor and typing new characters or hitting delete. And so a computer needs to do all of that thinking and work for the human. And the piece inside of the computer that does most of that work is indeed this device here called the CPU. Now, it turns out that CPUs today are actually getting pretty fancy. And inside of a CPU typically is one or more cores, so to speak. And a core is really what's doing the work. And it is the device inside of this device that actually can do addition and subtraction and multiplication and division and other operations still, loading information from memory, saving information to memory. And so a CPU like this might have one or two or four or more cores, which means it can do one or two or four or more things at a time. And that's great, because these days on my Mac or my PC, I might double click a whole bunch of icons. I might be running multiple programs. I might be chatting with a friend over here. I might be working on my homework over here. And so I might have a lot of programs and a lot of files open simultaneously. And thanks to multiple cores inside of a CPU, can each of those programs continue running in parallel? Maybe one is printing something to my printer. Maybe one is playing back a video. Maybe one is spell checking a file. Any number of operations can literally be happening simultaneously. Now, moreover, it turns out that the fanciest of CPUs today, from Intel especially, also support something called hyper-threading, which means you might just have one CPU or one core, but thanks to some technology built into the CPU itself, it will present itself to the computer, to the operating system, Mac OS or Windows, more on those in a bit, as though it's actually two CPUs or two cores. And so thanks to technology, can your computer actually think it has even more computational power than it actually has, thereby allowing it to take advantage of downtime or slow-running programs that might still allow you to run multiple things simultaneously. But we'll come back to that in just a bit. Now, not all devices have just a CPU connected to a motherboard. Some devices, instead, have a CPU and more all interconnected all at once. And these things are generally known as systems on a chip. And they're especially popular in things like tablets or iPads these days, game consoles like Xboxes, or even things like the Raspberry Pi, which is a very small computer that looks pretty much like this. Also not to scale. This thing could fit in the palm of my hand. And this has not only one of these silicon circuit boards, generally green, and you'll see there's very fine lines or traces that interconnect all of the chips and technology that's plugged into this thing. And it also has, first and foremost, no case. There's no pretty plastic case that protects all of these components. It really is just a raw piece of hardware that computer technophiles like to use to build their own machines and programs. But it has a whole bunch of ports, as we'll return to in a bit, a whole bunch of places you can connect other devices. But these systems on a chip all come together, and they do many things beyond just the CPU's task alone. But what else is inside of your computer? Well, the CPU is the brain, and the CPU on a system on a chip is there to the brain. But there's other components necessary inside of a computer so it can do actual work. And one of those things is called memory, or random access memory. And random access memory